Soft, warm summer wind, the smell of smoke rising from a giant bonfire, and the rustle of leaves blowing through the limbs of the deep woods, all are woven into the tapestry of a single memory which still haunts me to this day. My mother and her sister had once lived in a quiet rural childhood existence far in the southern Appalachian foothills during the stark years of the Depression. The summers were long trials of work on their father's farm, hauling buckets of water over their shoulders in the fiery midday sun to their brothers as they worked in the fields. There were no cars in these parts and no electricity to light the heavy darkness of the evening. As the winter months approached, they attended to their education at the little log schoolhouse some 3 miles away from their homestead. In later years, my aunt would marry a small business owner in the nearby town, and they would purchase and renovate this same schoolhouse. By the 1970s, the cabin and the property surrounding it would become their vacation spot, and it was here where our family's gatherings would be held for years to come. These cookout picnics would become the highlight of me and my multitude of cousins' summers. There was a well-stocked catfish pond where we could fish, and paths mowed through the woods where we could ride three-wheelers. Adults could indulge in skeet shooting and never-ending socializing while they fished and played horseshoes until the late hours of the night. Truly, however, the real thrill for me and the small group of kids I had known since birth was wandering in the woods. In retrospect, I find it amazing and ironic that my stern, protective mother, who would not even let me bike ride further than our block in town, would allow me to wander acres of dense woodland for hours without adult supervision. I realize now that to her, the woods were safer than the street, and the fact has remained embedded in my mind ever since. She had more faith in my ability to avoid a rattlesnake than the grabbing hands of a kidnapper. It was dusk and the woods were darkening as me, Brandon, Kelly, and a host of younger kids were following along the banks of a stream cut in the forest floor. We hurled hedge balls into the foliage and collected buckeyes in our pockets as we debated the superiority of one superhero over another, or the new season lineup of Saturday morning cartoons. We were still of an age when the difference between us and our female cousins was merely aesthetic, as they were as strong-willed and ready to wander as us. Kelly, a farm girl herself, had no compunction about climbing a tree or catching a toad. At times, she seemed even more ready to indulge in physical violence than us, and the dark blue-black bruises of her punches were legendary. We had glanced a clearing near the dry brook, and the smaller kids, Lucy, Frankie, Patty, and Court, all followed behind us with an innate passivity to our worldliness and experience. They may have questioned and argued with every syllable uttered to them by their parents, but they bent to our authority without the least hint of rebellion. The clearing was an Eden of wildflowers, and we were immediately enthralled by the song of buzzing cicadas as they droned in a chorus of hundreds from the trees around us. The combined symphony of crickets, birds, and spring frogs made the pastoral scene hypnotic and mystical as the twilight quickened and the shadows grew long. It was then that we spotted the woman seated alone in the lichen-covered body of a massive fallen tree. Her dress was a dark lavender, and her brown hair flowing down freely over her shoulders as she read from a leather-bound book held in her small, pale hands. She looked up and smiled, her hazy eyes shining behind a tiny pair of round glasses which were perched on her pretty nose. "Hello, children," she said quietly, as she studied us with her bright, intelligent gaze. "You've wandered quite far, haven't you?" "Yes, ma'am," Brandon answered, smiling bashfully. The woman's beauty was making us all somewhat uncomfortable. "It's okay. We know these woods real good," Kelly said proudly as she pushed stray locks of curly blonde hair from her eyes. "Who are you?" I said, as she turned her shining gaze upon me. "My name is Brenda," she answered, but offered no further introduction. "You all should go back to your party now. It's getting very late, and there are bad things that come out at night." Knowing we had never wandered this far before, we glanced at each other with trepidation. "We aren't scared," little Frank said defiantly. "What kind of bad things?" tiny Lucy whispered as she moved closer to Kelly's side. "Well, my dears," she answered as she closed her book and stared off into the darkening trees. "Do you see that hill over there behind those trees?" We nodded that we did. Did you know that this is a very special place? The Choctaw Indians used to bury their dead on that hill. An Indian burial ground, Brandon expounded with glee. Can we go look at it? I really wouldn't advise it, my dears. The Native Americans were very protective of their sacred places, and their priests sometimes left things to guard them. Like traps, Kelly asked as she put her arm around Lucy's shoulder. You could say that, but they were traps for the soul, not the body. How do you trap a soul? Brandon said suspiciously, as Patty and Court hid behind him with growing apprehension, their little eyes gazing at the mound with rising anxiety. Well, the priests called shamans would summon a dark spirit, which would lie sleeping until someone came too close to their sacred places. If someone came too close without permission of the priests, then it would awaken and slip into their minds. That's scary, Lucy said, as she wrapped her arms around Kelly's waist. Kelly seemed enwrapped in everything that the strange woman was saying, and her mouth hung open as it did sometimes when she was watching a particularly good movie on television. Yes, it is very scary. You see, once the spirit entered, it would make the person have nightmares, and very bad thoughts, which would make the person sad. The sadder the person became, the more powerful the spirit would grow, until there was nothing left of the person anymore. Soon the person would die, and all that remained was a shadow of all the bad things that the person had felt and done while the spirit was in them. That's so sad, Kelly whispered, before suddenly looking startled as she realized she had spoken out loud. The woman smiled wistfully as she looked down at the book in her hands, as if she were remembering something very painful. For a moment, I thought she might begin crying, but a sudden cold wind blew over the clearing as we realized that it was almost fully nightfall. The sun could no longer be seen through the branches of the moving, languid trees, and we looked at each other with the knowledge that we would have to return in the dark. Go now, children, the woman called Brenda said urgently, as she pointed at the opening where we had entered the grove. Find the stream and follow it back to the schoolhouse. Go, quickly. We took the hands of the little ones and began a dash for the opening just as the cold wind fell over us once more, like the brief snap of a winter gust. Goose flesh appeared all over my arms as I glanced over my shoulder and realized that the woman was gone. We managed to find the dried stream bed and began hastily following it through the now bending trees. I looked to my cousins for some comfort, but found their eyes were as wide and frightened as my own, as thorn bushes clawed at our clothes and tree limbs whipped at our faces. The little ones were crying when I first heard the sound, which floated low and distant at first, but was soon growing louder and gradually more audible as it was carried on the wind. I longed to put my hands over my ears and block the eerie, sad female wail which was piercing my skull and conceiving a fresh terror in my chest. But the fear of losing my grip on my younger cousins held my hands in check. We stumbled onto the main path with exultation as we broke into a dead run towards the schoolhouse, which lay still a quarter of a mile ahead. Kelly, who was bringing up the rear, suddenly halted as little Lucy tripped and fell with a sharp cry over a rock. As I looked back, I saw what I could only perceive as a large and looming shadow floating up the path from the woods behind us. Brandon turned and ran back to usher the two stragglers forward, but froze when he saw the torn, dark dress and pale, horrid face of the thing which approached. It gazed down at them with searing and endless hatred as its pursuit advanced, and its bony, sharp hands reached forward. I let loose of Frankie and told him, Patty, and Court to run as I dashed back to my cousins and grabbed Lucy into my arms. Being the largest of the older three, I knew I was the only one capable of carrying the weeping and terrified girl. As I lifted her, she locked her arms around me, and Kelly bravely began throwing rocks at the swiftly approaching horror. Its wails cut through my mind like stabbing icicles of pain and loss as Brandon lifted a stick from the ground and waved it defensively at the specter. He shouted obscenities which his mother would have throttled him for if she had heard, but his bravery lasted only until he saw that I was sprinting frantically down the path with Lucy. He and Kelly grabbed each other's hands as they too turned and fled. I do not know what nightmares the Wraith would have inflicted upon us if it had accomplished its assault, but remembering the words of the strange woman whom the specter had so resembled, I fear that it would have only been the beginning of our troubles. When we burst into the mowed clearing around the cabin, we saw the adults gathered together around Frankie, Patty, and Court as they hysterically babbled their tale of horror. When my mother saw me carrying Lucy, she rushed forward and immediately began to study the terrified girl's injury. She found her to only have a twisted ankle, and she was immediately taken to the cabin, as me, Kelly, and Brandon were led to the bright, warm light of the bonfire. We sat upon the ring of hay bales as we tried to relate the events of the past hour, but we found the faces of the family, now doubting and smiling. "Well, you kids had quite the adventure, didn't you?" my Uncle Gus laughed as he pulled a hot dog off the roasting stick and, placing it in a bun, handed it to his daughter. Kelly gazed at it as if it were repulsive, but took a bite nonetheless. "Scared the shit out of themselves, more like it," my dad laughed as he lit a cigarette and blew a cloud of smoke into the night air. "That was quite a wind. Thought we were in for a storm there for a minute," my dad's younger brother added. Soon the joking had begun, and we were left sitting in mute silence with our hot dogs and sodas as we watched our younger cousins, to our utter disbelief, begin playing again as if nothing had even happened. It was only my mother and my aunt who sat quietly alone at a picnic table, sipping iced tea and speaking in whispers with a conspiratorial demeanor. After a time, I saw my mother point to me and gesture for me to join them. Feeling oddly as if I had been chosen as a reluctant spokesman, I met the confused glances of Brandon and Kelly as I left the comforting warmth of the fireside. I sat down at the table beside my mother as she studied me from behind the thick lenses of her large black-rimmed glasses. "Kyle," she said quietly, as she placed her hand on my shoulder, and Aunt Rose lit a cigarette nervously. "What did you say the name of the woman you met in the clearing was?" There was no hint of mocking in her tone, only a sincere inquisitiveness, as if she were contemplating some deep and troubling history. "Brenda," I answered after clearing my throat awkwardly. "And what did she look like?" "She was real pretty, with long brown hair and sort of blue-green eyes. She had little glasses, and she wore a long purple dress." I watched as the two sisters looked at each other as if in silent counsel. "Mama, what are you talking about?" "Good Lord, I think he saw her," Aunt Rose said, as she flicked the cigarette with a shaking hand into the ashtray. "Hush, Rosie, you'll just scare him," Mom said irritably, but with a trace of fear. "Come on, Phyllis, you've got to tell him, or he'll just think he's crazy," Rose explained as she looked at me with sympathy in her gray, sharp eyes. "Tell me what?" I looked at them both with curious wonder. "Look, son," Mom began with a sigh. "When me and your Aunt Rose were around your age, we had a school teacher for about a year who sounds just like the woman you described in the woods. Back in those days, they had a hell of a time getting anyone out here to be a school mom, and we'd get a new lady living here with one of the local families every few years. Well, Miss Brenda, as we called her, was real young and well educated. She came from the college up near Wesley and took the job so she could write papers about the Indians that used to live in these parts. She came in all excited one day in the fall and was talking about how she found an old Choctaw graveyard in the woods a few miles from here. She spent a whole month poking around out there and gathering stuff to take back to the college in the summer. Well, that winter, she got real depressed, and sometimes she wouldn't even teach class. She'd just sit at her desk looking all tired and sad. And then sometime around Christmas, she didn't even show for class, and that was when our folks found her hanging in the woods from an old tree in that clearing you kids found." I stared at my mother with horror as I thought of the old rotten tree on which the woman had been sitting with the little book in her hand. "So she hanged herself when you were kids?" I said as I tried desperately to comprehend what was being told. "Then how could she have been out there to warn us?" My mother seemed unable to speak further without growing intensely emotional. She seemed to be struggling with what she had learned as much, if not more, than I was. Aunt Rose, however, was scrutinizing both of us with increasing agitation. "Well, whether you like it or not, you're not going to have to accept that there's things you cannot understand." She flicked her cigarette as if to punctuate her point. "Now, I myself am relieved to know what really happened to poor Miss Brenda, and I find some comfort in the thought that the good Lord saw fit to preserve at least some part of her soul from whatever evil she stumbled across out there in the woods. At least now, I know what I'm going to do with that land. Gus and I have been talking about selling it for years, but I think I'll call the Choctaw representative tomorrow and just tell them that they can have it. Lord knows, we don't have any business owning property with their dead buried on it anyway. But Aunt Rose, I said pleadingly, what about Miss Brenda? Will she be stuck out there forever? Honey, I don't think that the part of her that talked to you is really stuck out there at all. From the sound of it, she probably just showed up to make sure you kids didn't get hurt. That settles it, though. I want no part of that land. As it would happen, however, my Uncle Gus was not as willing as she to simply give away a substantial piece of property. The next day, he had gone into the woods alone to investigate and verify the presence of the Indian cemetery. He had returned with a new and disturbing perspective on what should be done with the land. The following events I can only relate from what I was able to piece together from various sources over the years to come. Aunt Rose and Gus had begun arguing relentlessly over the land on which the burial mound was located. Gus had become convinced that he could somehow extort a higher price from the property to the Choctaws. However, upon learning of the burial site, the tribal federation had immediately taken the issue to their lawyers, and a legal battle was soon underway. I overheard numerous conversations between my aunt and mother during which they discussed the growing tension in Rose's and Gus's marriage over the situation. Rose felt that not only was Gus displaying a sickening lack of morals, but that he was in fact gambling with their family's own financial well-being. By autumn, the relationship had deteriorated due to Gus's increasingly foul temperament and constant drinking. Following a bitter argument, Gus had left and taken up residence at the old schoolhouse. Over the next few weeks, he had grown gradually more reclusive and morose in his habits. He had all but abandoned the management of his own retail business to his subordinates and was by all accounts spending most of his time hunting alone in the woods and drowning slowly in an ever-deepening pool of alcoholism. Friends and family had been forced to give up in trying to reason with the now defensive and angry recluse as he escorted them away from his isolated hideout by gunpoint. The last phone conversation Rose had with her husband would cast a long and ominous shadow over all the remaining days of her life. It was midwinter and nearing Christmas when she had begged him to return home and spend the holiday with the children whom he had disregarded and ignored for months. It had become apparent that the Choctaw were going to win the lawsuit they had issued against Gus, and the land would go to them for a pittance of the excessive price he had set. Gus had poured his finances into lawyer fees, despite the protests of his family and business associates. It appeared that with everything that had occurred and the substantial damage he had done to his own reputation, that he would in fact lose his now failing business. On the phone, Gus had been drunk and incoherent as he rambled endlessly about trespassers from which he had been forced to guard the property. He spoke of a dark man whom he had witnessed daily roaming outside the windows of the cabin, but who would vanish as soon as he went out to confront him. He was convinced that a woman was sneaking into the schoolhouse and standing by his bed at night as he slept. He believed that she was an agent of the Choctaw as he heard her whispering, "Give them the land and leave," while he lay half asleep in bed. "They think I'm an idiot," he said furiously. "They think that by sneaking around and trying to scare me that I'll just roll over and let them take what's rightfully mine." He ended this last phone call with Rose mumbling obscenities and insults before slamming down the phone. It would be 2 days later when the police went out to Rose's request to check on Gus that they would find the log structure wrecked and empty. Gus had been living in squalor of bottles and animal bones for months. He had taken to eating the game he killed nearly raw and made no attempt to dispose of the remains afterwards. Upon searching the surrounding area, they found Gus dead of a self-inflicted gunshot wound in a small clearing near the burial mound. An autopsy would show that he was suffering from malnutrition, liver damage, and a body riddled with parasites. Rose, upon inheriting the full estate, had immediately signed over the deed of the entire property, schoolhouse included, to the Choctaw Indian Nation. The tribe had kept the cabin despite its dark history and turned it into a small museum of local Native history, which still stands to this day. The burial mound was left undisturbed and unexcavated. Visitors can view it from a safe distance on the kept path, but no one is allowed past the fenced grove which guards it. I have in my adulthood visited it 3 times with my cousins during our family reunions, which we have at the park area of the historical site. It may seem a grim location for us to reflect on the shadows of the past, but we have all agreed that it is only there that we can clearly recall the memory of soft, warm summer wind.